All right, ready?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Brian, we rolling? Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Shah as our seminar speaker today. I think for those of you who don't know her, she got her SB. It's not a BS, it's an SB. At MIT, they do things differently. She had her SB and then her SM, and then I don't know why they go back to PhD. It should be a DHP, all at MIT, and MIT is a good school. They have high standards for their faculty, so they liked her so much that they wanted to keep her there forever. So she's now at MIT. Before then, she did a small stint at Boeing. Some of you may have flown on some of their planes and liked the experience. So if you did, let her know. But she's has done a lot of thinking for the future of some of the automation for Boeing manufacturing, and especially how people can factor into the loop there. Her work has been recognized. I feel so old now because I'm looking at her thinking how young she is, and in such a short time won many best papers, and then in 2013 was nominated one of the top 10 innovators by the MIT, what is MIT again? Technology Review. And you look, it's just an amazing, it's the amount of accomplishments she's gotten in such a short time. And today, what she's going to do is talk about what she did to earn these fine awards. So,
oh my goodness, thank you very much for that introduction. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. My name is Julie Shah. I'm an assistant professor at MIT in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I lead the Interactive Robotics group as a part of the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And my area of research is human-robot interaction. I work on integrating robots and autonomous systems into human environments to work with people in time-critical, safety-critical applications. And today what I'm going to talk about are the particular challenges of integrating robots to work interdependently with people. What we do in my group is algorithms. We do planning, decision-making, and control algorithms. And what we specialize in is how we modify those algorithms so that these robots work more effectively and more naturally in an interdependent fashion with people. And so we do our work in two primary applications. The first one, which I'll be talking about today, is in manufacturing and assembly. This is integrating robots onto factory floors to work with people to improve the efficiency with which we build large commercial airplanes, do final assembly of cars, as well as smaller assemblies such as electronics. And the other main area we do work in is in reducing the burden of deploying robots for disaster response applications. And today I'll focus primarily on the manufacturing and assembly applications because what's happening in this space is wild. When I tell people I'm doing work in industrial robotics for manufacturing, people typically look at me in one of two ways. Either their eyes glaze over and they say, we solved industrial robotics in the 80s or before, and there's nothing going on in this space. And the other half of the people see what's happening here, as many of you do here as well. And what I want to do is tell you about the special challenges and the incredible opportunity here. So who has seen or been in a factory? What sort of factory? The automobile industry, okay. And if you were to guess which industry is the most successful at deploying robotics and autonomous, or robotics and automation, it would be which industry? Okay, the automotive industry. What was that?
Ballpoint pens.
Oh, so it turns out things like placing chocolates. I mean, about 90% of the work of placing chocolates into little cups is done by robotics today. The automotive industry is typically thought of as one of the most or more successful industries at deploying robotics and automation. A little known fact is that only about half of the work done to assemble a car today is done by robotics and automation. That half is the final assembly of the car, so that's putting in the seats, the insulation, the wiring, and that half takes up half the factory footprint and half the build schedule. there are a number of other industries that are lagging further in the introduction of robotics and automation. Building of large commercial airplanes, like a huge 747, about 70 to 80% of that work is still done by people today, not just final assembly, the entire assembly process. It's a beehive of people putting together these planes. Electronics, assembling your cell phone, 90% of that is still done manually, and much of the work done by small business manufacturing today is still done manually. And there are a number of reasons for the lagging adoption of robotics across these different industries, and the reasons do vary based on industry, but there are some common reasons as well. One of the common reasons is that typically today when we go to deploy an industrial robot, we need to make a decision about our process. Can it be done entirely by robots or automation today? And if not, we need to convert it to a manual process. And a part of that reason is because today industrial robots need to be caged and they need to be kept physically separate from people. What that means is, even if we have a part of the manual process of building up a plane or building up a car that can be done by a robot, it's often not practical to carve that out, pull it out of the rest of the workflow, and then fixture and structure the task so it can be performed by this robot system. So this fact is changing, this paradigm is changing. Factories of the near future are going to look very different than the factories we're used to seeing today. One of those reasons is that we're beginning to see safety standards and technical specifications to, I kid you not, put these large, dangerous industrial robots onto mobile bases and rails and have them move and work in the same space as people. We still need to maintain safety, but rather than doing that through a physical barrier, we're doing that through sensing and computation. So we sense people in the space, and we slow and we stop the robot as a person approaches it. At the same time, so this is an exciting new trend in uses of what are standard industrial robots. At the same time, we're seeing the development of a fundamentally new type of industrial robot hardware, and these are being called inherently human-safe robots. I prefer the term mostly not dangerous because they can still hurt you. But the idea is that they can work next to you, elbow to elbow. They can hit you without permanently harming you in any way and without that external infrastructure of the extra sensing and the extra computation to make this safe. So what I'm interested in is not how we make these systems safe, because that's ongoing work, but how we can take maximum advantage of the new flexibility afforded to us by these systems. Given we're beginning to understand how to do this safely, how do we deploy a robot? How do we task it, schedule it? How do we enable it to learn about how to work with people in a way that meets the safety standard, but improves the efficiency of the interaction? So that's the goal. We work on this problem at two levels. One is at the higher level. How do we do dynamic sequencing and scheduling of work across a factory, where some work is done by people, some work is done by robots, there's precedence constraints. And wherever we have manual work, we have process time variability. People don't always do things the same way or in the same amount of time. On the other hand, we also have a challenge of how we put robots to assist in manual complex tasks more on the elbow-to-elbow side. And what I'm going to do is talk about these two levels, one at the factory level and one at the human-to-robot one-on-one level, in terms of how we can support three facets of teamwork, three elements we know that make highly productive and effective human teammates. So what we want here is we want to be able to develop robots that can coordinate to adapt to disturbance in these environments, with the understanding that humans are the ultimate uncontrollable entity. We can't control about what they do, so we want to be able to adapt. A lot of the work that's done in these domains is codified through procedures, but much of it isn't actually. And I'll talk a little bit about that, about my observations out at Boeing. And what we need is for a way for these systems to extract implicit domain knowledge from the human teams, from the environment, in order to be able to work more effectively with humans. And we also want them to be able to learn team fluency through experience and practice, so get better and better as they develop better statistical models of how humans behave. So we'll start with the first one. How do we develop robot systems that are able to coordinate to adapt to disturbance? This is a computational challenge, what's underlying this. And the motivation for this is that why do we want to be able to have robot workers that adapt to disturbance? Well, ideally, if we want a factory out at Boeing to look more like most of the automotive factories we see, we'd want to replace all of these human workers with robotic systems. The truth of the matter is that's a long-term goal, 20 sort of plus years. In the intermediate time, we can begin introducing robots to do some of this work. But the people are not keeping to a fixed schedule. So when a part is late, when rework needs to be done, people talk to other people to decide how to continue on. What we have here now is an integration issue. We have people changing the sequence and scheduling of the factory work. And what we need are robots that are able to take as input those changes and adapt their own sequencing and scheduling in response to these changes. And so what we want is to move away from the systems we currently see, which are multi-robot cells. When a person needs to come into the cell, that entire cell is shut down for the duration the person is in it. What we want instead is for a robot to be able to request to come into a certain space for a certain amount of time. For example, say I need the left half of the fuselage for a half hour. And we want is for the robots to take in that constraint, to retask, resequence, and reschedule their work so that they can still continue to make progress despite this unanticipated disturbance. So what are the real-world near-term applications for this? I can tell you about a few in aerospace manufacturing. So this is an industry that I mentioned maybe 70 or 80% of the work is still done manually. That remaining work that's done by automated systems is typically done by what's called monument automated systems. So they're called monuments because they're huge structures. They take up a large part of a room. They're fixed to the factory floor, and the parts come to them. And so these systems are used for drilling large aerospace structures and for composite material placement. Drilling is a big deal in aerospace. 747 requires 1 million holes to be drilled during assembly. Much of that is still done by people. When it's not, it's done by the system. So what we're seeing is a trend moving from these monument systems to more right-sized, reconfigurable robot systems. So these are robot manipulator arms with highly specialized end effectors, and they can move to the part. And what's nice about this is we can now get multiple of these robots on a wing or on a fuselage laying down composite material placement or drilling. One of the challenges that this technology of the robot arm, those never break, this here tends to, it's newer technology, people need to come in, quality assurance needs to come into the space, so the interruptions are frequent. What we want is a system that's able to dynamically recompute task assignment and schedules in response to this input from supervisors or operators that want to change the schedule. And the proprietary methods for relatively small multi-robot cells may take a half hour, an hour, or multiple hours to recompute these schedules. And that's OK if it happens once occasionally. But when it happens multiple times in a shift, we have a problem. So what we want are faster techniques to be able to compute these task assignment and schedules. We want to be able to take as input a temporal plan, which involves the tasks to be executed, expected times that they take, minimum, maximum times that they take. We want to be able to take as input precedence constraints. One task or process needs to happen before another. Typically, there are temporal constraints as well, upper bound and lower bound temporal constraints. An upper bound window that certain work needs to be done in first shift or within a certain time a tool is available. We typically have lower bound temporal constraints as well, called wait constraints. An example of this is we need to wait a half hour for one coat of paint to dry before we lay down another coat of paint. And we have different agents, different robots, which can perform the different tasks, as well as a spatial configuration at which the different tasks are performed. And we typically have constraints, space-based constraints, such as spatial proximity constraints. People and robots can't be too close. Two robots can't be working in the same area at the same time. What we want is to be able to optimize this work-sharing problem of this multi-robot system as a function of completion time, information on robot reliability, history from previous runs, and input, changing input from the human operator. And the goal here is to be able to update the schedule quickly in seconds so that we can have a system that's more interactive and that can overcome these schedule disturbances. So this is a task assignment and scheduling problem. It can be readily formulated as a mixed integer linear program. The challenge of coordinating multiple robots operating in the same physical space is that we have very tightly coupled constraints, upper bound constraints, lower bound constraints, and spatial constraints. These constraints are tightly intercoupled, and they don't really lend themselves to the typical techniques for scaling to large sizes, decomposition techniques. And that's because we typically can't get informative cuts through the search space. The intuitive reason for this is that each agent's contribution to the objective function is coupled to the other agent's task assignments and sequences. So the particular allocation and sequence of one agent affects the goodness of the allocation and sequence of the other agents. And that's a characteristic of working in the tight physical space. So UAV tasking and scheduling of aerial vehicles typically can use alternate techniques. You can decompose, for example, space and time. You can say within a sector, a certain agent is going to do work, and then let's sequence the work for that agent within that sector without it really impacting the work of the other agents. This is one example of a technique that won't work here. So what we observe is that in this problem, we need to leave time and space intercoupled, but we decompose the problem in an alternate way. So what we observe is that the real bottleneck in this process isn't in the task allocation, it's in the sequencing and scheduling. In the worst case, the sequencing and scheduling is factorial. We have more structure to the problem inputs that we take here, but nonetheless it is still the main significant bottleneck. So what we do is we develop a very fast status-spicing schedulability test, a mechanism for testing the schedulability of a task set, and then sequencing and scheduling that task set. And we embed this fast technique within the loop of a larger optimization program and trade between the allocation and the sequencing and scheduling. So our goal here is to reduce this bottleneck at the sequencing and scheduling. And the way we do that is through a processor scheduling approach. And this is a problem that many different fields care about deeply. So AI, OR, look at these sorts of problems. Another field that looks at this problem is real-time processor scheduling. So this, for example, scheduling the processes within an avionics processor on a commercial aircraft. And this community kind of approaches the problem in a different way, which is advantageous for us in this application. So what we do is we model each of the robots here as a processor within a computer. And we talk about the space that they need to negotiate, where the work is performed, as shared memory resources within the computer that these processors need to access through mutual exclusion. And the form of the problem, as it's discussed in processor scheduling, is called a self-suspending task model. That's the problem that most closely maps to the problem we care about here, where we have upper bound deadlines, and critically, we also have lower bound deadlines, that wait time, for example, for paint to dry. That maps to a processor blocking due to work being done by a PPU or a GPU. And because of the increasing prevalence of PPUs and GPUs, this is actually a problem that's of increasing interest to the processor scheduling community as well. So what we do is we map the manufacturing task to this self-suspending task model. And we aim to develop a polynomial time satisficing schedulability test for this task set. So what we want to do is put in this task set and get a very quick answer. Yes, I can schedule it, or I don't know if I can schedule it. That's all we can get if we're going to do it in polynomial time. The goal is to make this test as tight as possible, to reduce the frequency of times we get back this I don't know. And so this is a technique or an approach that others in processor scheduling work towards. And this problem of scheduling or testing the schedulability of a self-suspending task network has been studied for restricted problem structures. So the way these techniques work is they restrict the behavior of the scheduler and then leverage the problem structure to be able to compute this tight bound. So you can restrict the behavior of the schedule in multiple ways, but then you need to leverage the problem structure. So the particular problem structures that have been investigated previously and have been solved look like this. We have one task, which is composed of a number of precedence-related subtasks, and then we have a whole bunch of free tasks. So our goal here is to figure out how to interleave each of these tasks within the wait durations of that upper task with its various subtasks. So you only have one task with subtasks, and then everything else is free, and that's your flexibility to try to figure out how to interleave and develop a tight test. So this has been solved. Researchers have also solved the problem where we have any number of tasks, and each task is only composed of two subtasks. So this is a particular structure that people have leveraged to compute a tight schedulability test. And what we want to do in our application is different. We want to be able to compute a schedulability test for any number of tasks with any number of subtasks. And now on top of that, we want to add in these upper bound temporal deadlines. Typically, the temporal deadline just relates the period. And we also want to add in shared memory resources. So this is a problem unsolved previously, not only for the multiprocessor case, but unsolved for the uniprocessor case as well. And so for the uniprocessor case, what we can do is restrict the behavior of our scheduler in a particular way and leverage the structure of this network through a fast edge-checking algorithm to be able to compute a polynomial time schedulability test. And what this test basically does is say, well, for a single processor, how do we interleave our tasks according to these deadlines? Well, the best we can do is going to be at least the total working time of the processes we have to execute. And then what we do is we say, with the complexity of this problem, the NP-hard nature of this processor scheduling problem comes from the interplay between the upper and lower bound temporal constraints. So wherever we have an upper bound temporal constraint, we take that wait time and we just treat it as task cost. That's difficult to reason on. So we take our losses there and we treat that as idle time due to those deadlines. And then with the remaining tasks, what we do is look at a worst case interleaving of all the tasks within all the other tasks that are constrained by deadlines. So it's a worst case analysis of the various possible interleavings. And the benefit of this is that it's closed form, and it's for this more general network than has been solved previously. It's satisficing, so we're not optimizing according to any criteria. And it's incomplete, right? So when we ask it for, can we solve it, we get back a yes or I don't know, rather than a yes or a no. The benefit of this is that it's very, very fast. So here we're benchmarking this schedulability test against SAT solvers, circuit SAT, TSAT++, just to give you a sense. Those are complete solvers. Typically, these will time out at somewhere around 100 subtasks. And we can test the schedulability of task sets with up to 1,000 tasks, usually in about a second. And to our knowledge, these are problems that were not solved previously. You don't get something for nothing, though. And what we lose here is optimality. So for this set of problems which we can solve an optimal for example, here the optimal is to minimize the make span, which we have to solve using different techniques. What we can show is that if about 1/4 of our temporal constraints are these lower bound weight constraints. Remember, these are the hard constraints. If only about 1/4 of them are weight constraints, empirically we can achieve within about 10% of the true optimal, which is quite good for the applications of interest to us. So now the problem is we now want to extend this from a single agent to multiple agents. This is a single processor, no shared memory resources. So now we want multiple agents and we want shared memory resources. And this is doing a worst case analysis of all the interleavings. Once you extend this to multiple agents, it becomes highly conservative. So what we do is we take this idea, this schedulability test, we turn it into a light schedulability test and embed it within a scheduling simulator. So whenever we're about to make a scheduling commitment, we run this test and say, can we at this point make this commitment? And what that allows us to do is reduce the uncertainty with the commitments made so far and produce a less conservative schedule going forward. So what we do is we take this schedulability test and we embed it as a subroutine within a standard mixed integer linear program solver. We use Gurobi for solving the agent allocation problem. We produce an optimal agent allocation problem according to a heuristic optimization function. We throw that to the sequencing subroutine. We say, can we solve it? If not, we iterate back to the next agent allocation. We go back and forth until we find one that meets our schedule constraints. So when we put this to a multi-agent system, again, scheduling through simulation, what we're able to show is that we can schedule up to 10 agents. We've extended this out to 700 tasks, usually within about 10 seconds. All prior state-of-the-art techniques we've looked at and benchmarked against pretty much timeout. Here we're doing a timeout of 30 minutes for 4 or 5 agents, about 50 tasks. So we can solve much larger problem instances. And again, we can show for the multi-agent case, as well as for that single agent case, that we can produce solutions that are within approximately 10% of the optimal for the size problems we can benchmark against. We've also benchmarked this against proprietary solution techniques as we were able to. These are for smaller task sets. What we can show is that compared to other heuristic proprietary scheduling techniques, we typically produce schedules which are at least 10% better than these other techniques. So the goal here is to use this as a capability for developing robots that can adapt to disturbance more the way people do. And so if we show you what a large-scale demo looks like, to kind of give you an imagination of what a factory of the near future will look like, here we have a 5-agent task set about 110 tasks. A person is requested to come into the space, so the robots have reallocated, resequenced, rescheduled their work. That top robot breaks down. The colors are showing you how the work is being redistributed. This allows interactivity, so a supervisor can change and, for example, accelerate deadlines on a part of the task set. And here, the upper part of the fuselage needs to be finished sooner, and the agents reallocate. This is a problem that would have taken hours to solve previously. Boeing Research and Technology is the sponsor of this. There's IP associated with this, and excited to report that it will be implemented on a factory floor in the near future. And so what we're doing now with this project is two things. One, this is for a single cell in a factory. You can imagine a single cell for where you're building up a fuselage, but this large factory is composed of multiple cells. So how do you scale this up in a hierarchical fashion and ultimately distribute it to take advantage of the natural decouplings in the different cells? We want to be able to trade robots between cells, so when one robot goes down, we can pull a robot from another cell in an intelligent fashion. The other avenue for this work going forward is looking at applying this to more typical assembly lines, for example, automotive assembly lines, how we can do dynamic sequencing and scheduling of work on, for example, automotive final assembly. And because I have a human factors engineering background before I did AI, I know that the fanciest algorithms are only useful if they are easy to use. So we conduct human subject experiments with these algorithms to understand how it is a person should interact with them. And in particular, what does it mean if a person is doing some of this work? The robots are getting real-time updates on the schedule of the work that people are doing, and then the robots are resequencing and scheduling their work differently from day to day and shift to shift. What the robots are going to do is going to look differently to a person, and that has implications for acceptance. It has implications for shared situational awareness on the factory floor, which are very important to the acceptance of this technology ultimately. So that's a briefing on some of our work in terms of how we're thinking about the computational challenges of coordinating robots to be able to respond to disturbances in a timely fashion. That's not good enough, though. And the reason that's not good enough is because from my time on the factory floor, this stunned me. But anybody else who works in manufacturing is not stunned by this. This stunned me. The plane is actually built differently from day to day and shift to shift. Who would have guessed that? I wouldn't have guessed that. And the reason is that important parts of the process, such as tolerances, are well specified. But wherever you have manual work, you have people tailoring the manual work. And in this case, you have a team of people working together. And they develop their own style, their own sequence, their own ordering of the work. And so in order to be able to use this sort of scheduling software, we really need to do a good job of being able to extract domain knowledge, human domain knowledge from natural human workflow, and potentially use that to seed the schedules that are produced so that they're in a space that makes sense to people. We also want to be able to pull information about how people are reorganizing the work on their part of the process and use that as input to these automated schedulers. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how we're thinking about extracting domain knowledge from natural human workflow. So this has applications for automated scheduling. It has applications for other areas as well. Disaster response, we want to think about reducing the burden of deploying robot systems. And deployments in disaster response are typically planned by teams, and then teams deploy. So a team sits in a room and plans, and then potentially someone has to go and translate that planning session into a program for the robot to execute. And so one of our secondary motivations here is to think about how we can observe natural human-team planning conversation and automatically translate that into a robot task plan that understands the interdependencies of the teamwork and can deploy as a part of the team. So this is looking kind of further out in terms of time horizon for technology. And so what we do in this work is we take in conversation data of teams planning a scenario. And we're not solving the natural language processing part of this problem. That's multiple PhDs in and of itself, and my lab doesn't do much in natural language processing. So what we do is we manually code that raw planning conversation into a structured form for each utterance in the planning conversation, like a machine understandable form. And we take that as input. And what we're aiming to do is take that as input and infer the finally agreed upon plan that the people agreed to. This is a difficult problem. And I want to underscore the difficulty of the problem from the human subject experiments we conducted, where we watched people plan and log their data to be able to analyze and to use in these techniques. We gave people this simple task. We have 8 rooms on the floor. 3 rooms have patients. The other 2 rooms have leaky valves. A robot needs to inspect each room before a human crew can enter. And the goal here is to triage all patients, fix all valves, and inspect all rooms. We had 44 teams of 2 people log into a tool to plan for this scenario in a chat window with each other. And of those 44 teams, each team produced a unique plan. So, what's more, about 80% of each team's planning conversation didn't make it into the finally agreed upon plan. So we have a significant noise rejection problem here. I want to show you a video of 2 of the teams reading their transcript afterwards from their planning session so you can get a sense of what the planning conversation looks like. OK, this is good. So this is the scenario.
I think we should plan to have as many people working at once as possible.
Divide the whole space and send red robot to check room A to D, blue robot to check H to E.
Wait, but then we have one time step where A and H are being checked, and there is nothing for the other teams to do. Partition is good though. So how about...
Okay, you're right, but I just noticed we have people in problems in rooms B and G. So step 1, B, blue.
Doing step 2 like that isn't good for the other crews, since there was only 1 mechanic and 2 meds.
Correction with robots. Step 2 would be F red,
OK.
C blue.
So this continues on.
Red robot got damaged.
Okay, we only have 1 robot now.
So, ooh, I have to try to find my PowerPoint. Here we go. OK. So the characteristics of what we take as input. What we're taking as input is, at the utterance level, we're taking in relatively ordered, noisy plan parts, or represented as grounded predicates in this case. So at the utterance level, we're coding that as, first let's do A, then C. So we have A and then C, which are locally ordered here. Then we should do D and E together. So those occur in parallel here. Great, we can do H after that. Even though we see this as H after that, we code it based on each individual utterance. So this just shows up as an H. And what we're looking to do is infer the finally agreed upon plan, which is the fully ordered set of grounded predicates as they appear in the final plan someone would write down that they believe they agreed to. And so even though we manually tag this data into a structured form, it preserves a lot of the very difficult characteristics of human planning conversation. We have changes of plans, we have typos, we have, based on the nature of how we're tagging it, we have temporal relationships that are lost. Inference in the solution space is large, so there's like at least 12 trillion possible plans. And as I mentioned, each of the 44 teams produced a unique plan. The conversation is succinct. We have suggestions that violate constraints typically, and much of the conversation doesn't even end up in the finally agreed upon plan. So how do we approach this problem? What we do is we propose a generative modeling technique, and we integrate logical components into the generative modeling technique to provide structure over the prior possible space of plans to improve the efficiency of the inference. And what this allows us to do is perform inference over this very large solution space with what's really a relatively small amount of noisy data. And what we can show is that we can actually successfully infer the finally agreed upon plan in terms of correct sequencing and task allocation with up to 90% accuracy. And so this is related to a growing body of literature aimed at combining logical approaches with probabilistic models. We've seen work in statistical models over relational domains, Markov logic networks, for example. And here what we're doing is we're specifically incorporating a logical planning technique, plan validation, using a PDDL style plan validator to provide this structure over the prior in the generative model. So we design a generative model. And the way we do this is, as I said, we shape the prior probability over this plan space based on whether the plan, according to how we understand the planning problem, based on whether a particular plan is valid or invalid according to those constraints. And we don't completely disallow invalid plans, because actually many of the times people are agreeing to what are invalid plans. So that's very important here. And this technique provides you flexibility to infer those plans which may be invalid to some of the constraints. And we shape this prior probability using a PDDL plan validator. We're using the variant of PDDL 2.1 here. And what we take as input are the available actions, the preconditions, postconditions, the available resources, the initial condition, the goal condition, a candidate plan. And then what our output is yes, is this a valid plan? No, this is not a valid plan. And we're using this as a part of the scoring in our sampling step. And to do this, we use a combination of Gibbs sampling as well as Metropolis-Hastings sampling. And we have to do MH sampling because what is the problem with sampling the plan space? There's no obvious conjugate prior, and it's intractable for us to calculate the normalization constant. So for this fictional rescue scenario, this is a simple one. We also did a second one as well. What is the outcome? So by shaping this prior distribution over the plan space using knowledge of the structure of the planning technique, we actually are able to significantly improve the inference of the final plan. So on average, we're able to get, on that first line with PDDL, we were able to get 91% of the plan correctly. So in the task allocation, that's 84% of the allocations of agents to tasks is inferred correctly, and we have 100% noise rejection. That's that 80% that doesn't end up in the finally agreed upon plan. With no structure, with no plan structure, this total number of average accuracy drops to 82%. So the natural question to ask is, well, now we've just translated the problem of programming a robot to programming perfect PDDL plan specifications. So what we want to do is look at what is the benefit of this with degraded PDDL. For example, what happens when we're missing a constraint, or what happens when our plan specification is missing goals and constants. It turns out missing constraints really just doesn't really hurt you any more than not having PDDL at all. But if we have missing goals and constants, this is more significant. So this can actually degrade the inference of the finally agreed upon plan in such a way that it's potentially worse than if you added no plan structure at all. So the outcome here is, these are first steps. Adding plan structure is helpful. And the intuition for why this is helpful is when you and I are talking to each other and we're planning, we're using knowledge of the structure of the plan to piece together our own utterances into this finally agreed upon plan. So what we're trying to do is map that intuition for what we do here into this technique. And the following question is this good enough? So if someone presents you with a plan that's 90% right versus 60% right versus 70% right, are you able to pull out the parts of the plan that are not right and fix it? Maybe 90% right is more harmful than 60% right, because you go through and you just say, okay, it's mostly right, let's execute. So there's human factors involved here too to understand what are the implications of the algorithm, and specifically how do we integrate it with planners and schedulers. Okay, what I'd like to do in the few minutes I have remaining before I open it up to questions is just touch on some of the challenges of learning team fluency through experience and practice. As I mentioned, much of manual work, wherever we see manual work, we see individualized styles for performing that work. And that poses challenges for tasking a robot to assist a person side by side. Because if we program a robot to work with one person, that doesn't necessarily mean that robot will work effectively with another person. And so what we want to do is be able to develop individualized models for how a robot can develop, for example, a statistical model of human behavior, and then use that in its own task plan to figure out what actions to take, and what order to take those actions in, and then how to schedule them. The safety standards for human-robot collaboration with industrial robots looks something like this. So this is an implementation in our lab. They require that the robot slow and stop as a person nears the robot. So you can see as a person comes into space, the robot slows and stops before it makes contact. One of the challenges with these safety standards is that this robot is performing a pre-sequenced set of actions, and if the person happens to be in that space, that robot will just stop for a long while, right? And it's not taking into account knowledge of where that person will be next. So while we want to maintain the safety standards, what we want to do is be able to add a little bit of anticipation in this robot, a little bit of understanding of where that person will be, so as to improve the efficiency of this interaction. That's the goal. And the way we approach this is to try to take insight from how human teams learn to work together effectively over time. So a standard, gold standard technique in human team training is something called cross-training. That's where people physically switch roles and take someone else's job for some period of time. They do this in the factory, aviation crews do this, military tactical teams do this. There's a practical benefit, for example, in the factory. If someone is out sick, someone else knows how to do their job. But there's another benefit, which is empirically developed in the literature, which is that it enhances development of shared mental models. So something about actually taking someone else's job allows you not to only learn how to do your job, but to learn how your partner and what they need to do their job effectively. And you bring that knowledge back with you to then do your job not only better for yourself, but better for your teammates. And enhanced shared mental models, training through cross-training, also shows a benefit in off-nominal circumstances when things don't go according to plan. So what we noticed, or what we thought, was that many of the techniques we use to train robots is really focused on one-way transfer of information from the person to the robot. That does not look like human team training techniques. So for example, training a robot through interactive reward. The robot does something, you say good, the robot does something, you say bad, and it learns over time. That's transferring one way from the person to the robot. That is actually documented as among the most inefficient techniques to train a team of people to work together. So we just thought as a hypothesis, what if we were to take a standard interactive reinforcement learning algorithm and modify it to take its inputs through cross-training with the person? Same inputs, but through a different mechanism. Not only do we support the robot's learning, but we now also support the human's learning of how to work with the robot. And maybe that leads to better team performance. And in our experiments, we do have a number of exciting statistically significant results. So what our hypothesis is that we can improve human-robot teams, we can improve their execution if they receive their training through cross-training rather than through, for example, in this case we use Sarsa Lambda as our benchmark. So we designed a computational framework for robot learning through cross-training, and then we compared it to Sarsa Lambda. What we did was conduct large-scale human subject experiments. We had 36 people come into the lab and trained to work with the robot in a graphical user interface environment. So we had half the people come in and train in cross-training, half the people come in and train through interactive reward. In cross-training, people and robot would physically switch roles. In interactive reward, the robot would do something and the person would assign a reward. What we then did was, for the first time, we had the person go and work with the real robot. And we measured objective measures of team fluency, as well as the robot's uncertainty on actions of the human teammate, and then subjective measures of team performance as well. And we did those subjective measures through a post-experiment questionnaire. So I'm going to show you two quick clips before I show you the results, so you can see the quality in the difference of the teamwork. The task here was a place and drill task. So the person placed 3 screws, and the robot drilled them in. The person could train the robot to work with them any way they wanted. The smart people knew that this is a real industrial robot and is very dangerous, and trained the robot to stay out of their way until they had placed all screws, and then the robot would come in and drill them. Other people were more efficiency motivated, and they aimed to train the robot to drill screws as soon as they were placed. So this is a video clip of a person working with the robot after they trained through interactive reward assignment. And what you can kind of see is the person places the screw and then kind of hesitates, looks to see what the robot's going to do. They don't really seem sure what the robot's going to do. And when the robot starts moving, they pull their hand out of the space. When the robot stops moving, they come back into the space. I can show you that again. I think it'll play fully the second time. So qualitatively, it seems as if the person is unsure of what the robot will do. OK. So this is a task execution after cross-training. And this looks pretty different. So in this case, the person places the first screw, goes to place the second screw, and stays in the space as the robot starts moving. And they finish the task. These are representative samples from the videos. What we saw was that human idle time decreased by 41% after cross-training, and concurrent motion increased by 71%. Both of these were statistically significant results. So what you see with your eyes does match up here. We used an MDP model as the computational model for training. And so what we can measure is the entropy rate within the MDP. And this corresponds to the robot's uncertainty in what the human will do next. And that's because we modeled the human as the stochasticity in the environment. And what we can see is after the 3 rounds of training, after cross-training, the robot is statistically significantly more sure what the robot will do than after interactive reward assignment. Now, why this is another question. This could be because of adaptation on the person's side. It could be because of better learning on the robot side. The inputs are the same, but what the inputs mean is different. It's not clear what someone means when they're assigning reward, whereas when you learn by switching roles, that's potentially more informative in this context. For the subjective measures, we saw a number of statistically significant subjective measures. And the subjective measures are very interesting to me because they're typically the most important for adoptance of the technology. And we saw statistically significant differences in people agreeing that they trusted the robot. They agreed more strongly they trusted the robot after cross-training than through the benchmark. And they agreed more strongly that the robot performed according to their preference. So as next steps, this is interesting because what this allows us to do is take these statistical models of human behavior, the robot's uncertainty and what the human will do next, and integrate it into a risk-aware motion planner to avoid the spaces potentially where the robot believes a person will be and reduce that slowing and stopping time. And so we did an experiment in which we pretended we had perfect information on where the person would be next. We forced them to place in a certain order to be able to scope the benefits of this approach. And what we found was that when the robot used this risk-aware motion planner, the team completed the task faster and with larger mean separation distance between the person and the robot. So what that means is we don't necessarily have to worry about trading safety and efficiency. With a little adaptation from the robot side, and if done well, we can actually achieve benefit on both those fronts. We can do the task more efficiently, and we can make it safer, arguably, by maintaining a larger separation distance between the person and the robot. So next steps, this is all with a manipulator arm. We're currently working on some of these same ideas, but in the context of mobile robotic assistance. So these are mobile robots delivering tools and materials on an automotive final assembly line. And here we have challenges just in basic mobility, the robot driving on and off a moving floor, motion planning in the same space as people, as well as the human factors of how the system interacts with people. But our first challenge over the last year was just basic mobility. We need the robot to be able to drive on and off a moving floor line without potentially nicking an expensive car as it crosses the line. And so that's a lower level kind of control and sensing problem. Which we've solved. And so now we're moving on to deployment, proof of concept on the factory floor, and to start thinking about the system moving and navigating in the same space as people. So to wrap up, so what I've done is talk about challenges kind of at 2 levels in the factory for factories of the future. Challenges in how we can increase efficiency of manufacturing and assembly through more dynamic sequencing and scheduling of human and robotic work. And how we can think about deploying robots that work side by side with people in a way that's individualized to that person and in a way that this robot can learn through experience and practice how to be a more effective teammate. And through the 3 challenges, one is a computational challenge of adapting to disturbance, and the other are more specific to interacting with people, how we can extract implicit domain knowledge from natural human workflow and then learn team fluency through experience and practice. And so the overall goal, the guiding principle across this work, is that we're aiming to improve efficiency of manufacturing and assembly through strategic integration of advanced robotic technology. And the guiding principle is that we want to preserve people to do the work they're good at and preserve flexibility for people. By preserving flexibility for people and enabling robots to be able to adapt even in limited ways, we can maintain people's autonomy, we can increase potential acceptance of the technology, and we can show demonstrated improvements in efficiency of the work as well. And we develop algorithms. I mentioned planning, decision-making, and control algorithms in my lab. But we also conduct human subject experiments to be able to understand their potential benefit and understand that the algorithm development is providing a useful purpose. And you can visit our website for information about the publications related to this work, as well as others, at interactive.mit.edu. And with that, I can wrap up and take any questions. Thank you very much.
That's fascinating. I didn't know you could make such a seemingly simple problem look so in all seriousness, particularly in the last aspect, in which there's certain things that people will do, sort of 2 parts to this. One is that we will every once in a while goof up, we slip.
Yes.
And is this method, would this accommodate the occasional goof on the part of the person? Throw that in that somehow?
So for the last piece, the cross-training element, adapting to the person, is that the part you're asking about? So the work I presented here doesn't handle that at all, and the experiments we conducted didn't investigate that at all. We believed that entropy rate might be an interesting measure because by post-analysis of the data, we found that when people experimented during training, that entropy rate would increase and could potentially be a selective measure for identifying that a person is deviating from the behavior you expect. And that's a possibility, but it's a difficult measure to compute selectively online. So we're exploring this problem of how we deal with, how we provide robustness to deviations in human behavior. And so the follow-on to this work, which wasn't quite mature enough for me to present here, is translating that work in the MDP framework to a partially observable framework or a mixed observability Markov decision process. Under which we're reasoning on the intention of the person or their preference for how to perform the task. And by reasoning over that intention, we can show significant robustness to deviation in human behavior. The robot still does something reasonable, even when the person deviates from exactly what they did in the training. And so those are exactly the next steps that we're currently thinking about.
So the other part of that you sort of alluded to. So it doesn't surprise me that craftsmen would do things unique. They have their nuances, they have their idiosyncrasies. So with this technique, I do things a certain way, Laura does the same task, but a different way.
Yep.
Now it knows I'm working with it versus it's working with Laura, so it behaves differently around each of us?
Exactly. Exactly. So one of the things you could think of as training the robot individually for a particular person. The other aspect we're looking at is people generally fall into types. So for example, in this experiment, there's a safe type and an efficient type. And that largely describes the different strategies well enough for a robot to effectively assist when the person deviates from the exact sequence they did during the training. And so also in follow-on work, we're looking at unsupervised techniques to cluster types or preferences of people. And then for each of those clusters, we represent the problem as a MOMDP, and we're doing inverse reinforcement learning to be able to learn the reward structure that allows the person to assist, or allows the robot to assist the person of that particular type. That's exactly right. That's exactly where our mind is for next steps as well. Thank you. Yeah?
Great stuff. I was kind of struck listening to your video of the team planning about how bad planners they were, or,
yes.
Or how easy to make decisions and not be aware of all the constraints. And I'm wondering, it seems to me you could get a much more productive interchange if you were a little more proactive and you could bounce off of human suggestions with, here are the consequences of that. And I'm just wondering I'm not quite sure what your exact motivation was for trying to capture the whole plan, but wouldn't you get a better plan faster if you let the machine work with planners?
Yeah, so that middle work isn't funded for a manufacturing context. It's actually for disaster response. So there's the Next Generation Incident Command System, which is a web-based tool that first responders are increasingly using to plan their deployments in a distributed fashion. And what's nice about that is they pull up a computer, they log into this web interface, and then they're doing their planning in chat windows. Audio is captured. There's maps, so you can draw on the maps. All of this is captured. So what we have is a means of capturing, more formally capturing these planning sessions. And so one of the goals would be to integrate an intelligent agent to participate in these planning sessions and improve the quality of the plan, or at the very least improve the quality of shared situational awareness during the planning. In terms of transitioning that to an online intelligent agent, that's further work for us, because as I said, we're not doing the natural language processing component currently. We're taking in the machine readable structured form. But I do have a student working in that area aiming to put that piece in so that we can potentially do some interactive tests with it. But that's a longer term goal for us.
The other thing I was worried, dominate here, but on your first section, your the work with Boeing, the processor scheduling. I wonder if if there's any possibility to feed that back into the processor scheduling community. I mean, you said.
Oh yeah,
you said
absolutely.
it
Yes,
hasn't been solved
it's been published in that community as well.
Yeah.
So the applications for that are huge. So they're in processor scheduling. They're in not just scheduling of robot work, but scheduling of manual work. You can model the takeoff and landings off a runway as a processor scheduling problem as well. So yeah.
So I wonder why that community never thought about that formulation.
Yeah. So the story behind this is I teach real-time systems and software at MIT, and I gave them like a midterm practice problem where I gave them like a reader-writers problem, and I said, imagine you have robots accessing a car. And in my mind, I'm like, this is a shared memory resource. How do you make sure that they, bolt and weld with mutual exclusion? And they didn't get they didn't make the mapping to the reader-writers problem. I went home that night and I was like, oh, geez, they didn't learn anything from my lectures. And then I was like, wait a minute, the car is a shared memory resource, the robots as processors. Then we looked into it, and as far as we could tell, nobody had done that mapping. And then that's how that research line began for us. But there's a lot that can be learned from other approaches, because they're vastly different approaches to basically the same problems across AI, OR, processor scheduling. I think there's a lot can be gained from the communities kind of coming together more closely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first part, planning scheduling, I think you're using the centralized algorithm. So did you consider using a decentralized algorithm which would actually to take the disturbances into account, so that if a robot, like a nearby robot, is not functioning or something, the robot can take care of that.
So can you repeat the question for me one more time? I want to make sure I understand it.
So you used a centralized algorithm,
Yes.
tertiary, I guess, for solving the problem. Did you consider using a decentralized algorithm? Because I think
a decentralized algorithm? Is that what you're asking? Yes. Okay. So this particular problem, for us, the main motivation for decentralizing would be to scale to larger problems. Within the single cell, it's the typical decomposition techniques such as Bender's decomposition. You just don't get informative cuts through the search space due to the intercoupled nature of the constraints. So because you don't have these natural decompositions, it's harder to distribute. And we have the ability, once intervals, we have the ability in the factory, full communication, connectivity, bandwidth, to take a centralized approach for a cell. Now the multi-cell, you have natural decomposition. That's how it's set up. And you also need to scale to a larger size. And so for that, we're beginning to think about decentralized distributed approaches. For the single cell, it's easier to get more optimal solutions if you reason in a centralized fashion, just due to the difficulty of finding good cuts through the search space. Yeah.
So I know next to nothing about planning, but all of this work on making the robots in the first part of your talk, this seems like a very nice algorithm, and it seems like it does a lot better than everything previously. Have you thought about can this be applied to people, like scheduling people, or scheduling other things like airplanes and stuff like that? And would you get the benefits that you're seeing here in those domains as well?
Yeah, so we're in discussions with, there's a number of people that want to use this as decision support for scheduling their manual work, because there's a story where there's one supervisor who understands the larger flow to the problem, and when they leave and rework or rescheduling has to be done, the people, the workers there will figure out a way to proceed, but without the bigger picture of how it impacts downstream. And small scheduling decisions at one point can be multi-million-dollar decisions, delays down the line, just because one person was in a meeting. So using this as decision support is, we're actively working on that application. In terms of other applications it can be used for, so there are limitations to this algorithm. We operate on a specific structure, a specific constraint structure, and there's an underlying assumption here, which is that switching costs or travel time between tasks, for example, is constant. So you need a task where that's a reasonable assumption. We're not solving a vehicle routing problem. This technique would not work for that sort of problem. So it turns out in the cell, the travel time within a localized cell is relatively small compared to the calibration, the setup, and actually doing the work where this is an appropriate assumption. So where you have that assumption holds and where you have constraints of this particular form, this is a great candidate, but it won't solve a traveling salesman problem or a vehicle routing problem.
So I was actually wondering, something similar to what Danny said. Of course, let me preface it, I have less knowledge of planning and scheduling than Danny has. Is what limits what you've done to robots?
Nothing.
Nothing.
On the algorithm side for the scheduling, nothing. Yeah.
Right. So as I was watching, I was thinking the same thing. It
Yeah.
was useful for people. Then I was wondering, there must be something about a robot that makes
No.
your unique.
No.
So along that line then, has anybody tried, you mentioned operations research, but has anybody tried to see if this model underlying what you're doing actually applies to how teams of humans interplay?
Oh, if you could use it to model how people are making scheduling decisions?
I'm not saying to actually model, who knows how they do it, but
Yeah.
does the model fit how people actually work as a team? That'd be interesting.
So in the because the constraints of this were designed for the manufacturing environment, many of these scenarios do fit this form of the task
Something
input.
totally different, like surgery, where there's no
our
robot whatsoever.
our other application, we're working with the local Boston hospital to do dynamic scheduling of resources on their labor and delivery floor, so bed allocation. And it turns out this is an appropriate sort of task structure for that application as well. But turns out this labor and delivery floor looks suspiciously like an assembly line. So it's kind of, yeah.
You are optimizing
Yeah.
a particular objective, right?
Yeah.
So it could look a lot different than the way people do it today.
Yeah.
It could be better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, all these algorithms, and there is a tradition, as you pointed out, they have been, of course, used for many, many applications in all kinds of things, right? So you schedule operating rooms as a job shop schedule, for example, okay? Or you schedule whatever, it doesn't matter, they have a lot of applications. The thing is now with the robots and so on, you want to make them more efficient and scalable in terms of scheduling people. People may or may not conform to the schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the other thing. It's not that because you have, even if you have an interface and you say choose according to these things, they may not. I mean,
Tasking the robots is cleaner. You can also get, yeah.
So that's a different so that's a different story. The thing that I wanted to ask is how much, what is the difference in timing or effort in the cross-training versus the reward?
We did not, that's a great question. We did not control for that. We controlled for the same number of inputs to the learning algorithm. The cross-training did take longer. It wasn't double the amount of time, but it was about like 1.25 more, factor more. So it was a longer interaction, which is true. So yeah.
So this line of questioning and discussion reminds me that a good number of years ago, several of us, probably still in this room, visited a factory that had been intentionally anti-optimized. The point was there were lots of trade secrets. Management didn't want any worker or any team to know what had happened before or after his step.
Whoa.
What could you do to help management there? The question, the place was anti-optimized.
Yeah, and so?
So no worker knew what happened before or after his job. Parts were moving from as far as possible one end of the plant to the other. What are you going to do?
No, you can still optimize the cell.
Oh, well,
Let's have Julie.
Just because you optimize the cell doesn't necessarily mean you optimize the full process, though. But you could optimize the cell. The other thing I can think of is there is work in computing temporal decouplings. So you could actively try to design the structure of your schedule to more actively decouple one cell from another, so that it's maybe more robust to schedule variations across cells. That would be an interesting problem. Yeah.
The other thing is you can of course collect data and try to do some inferencing in terms of what, and then try to optimize.
Okay, if we have no more questions, I just want to remind everyone. So Ellen, help me out here. Is the PSR, is it really 5?
Next door, you can talk with Dr. Shah and ask questions and socialize. There's also a teaching and there's a content cafeteria that's really fun at home. So I just want to point that out.
Thank you so much. And I forgot my most important slide, which is the people that do this research. If I could just take 30 more seconds. So I have a fantastic team. The students that did this research, Matthew Gamble, so he does the tasking and scheduling research. Bean Kim does inferring finally agreed upon plans, so that's her work. Stefanos Nicolaitis and Pem Lasoda do the final work on risk-aware planning and increasing transparency through human team training techniques. Vaibhav works on the mobile robotic assistant application, and we also have a fantastic team of undergraduate researchers. And with that, okay, I will really wrap up. Thank you very much.